Why are pivot tables so powerful?
I can process your data in seconds and create very powerful reports.
When most people first see a pivot table, it looks complicated. But underneath, a pivot table is actually doing something very simple. It filters records, then performs math on the remaining records, and it can do this thousands of times instantly. In its essence, a pivot table is just a massive filter and math machine. But before we explain this key concept in more detail, let me show you the amazing power of pivot tables by processing the list we have here. It is a list of orders, a small list, about 1,000 records. It has region, product, date of sale, customer name, and relevant financial details for each order. I will create a report to show total revenue per product per company. It will also show the number of orders and average order per product per customer. As I'm building this report, remember pivot tables are one of the safest tools in Excel to use. I use a copy of your data at all times, not your actual data itself. Never be afraid of using and experimenting with pivot tables. Okay, as mentioned, the key to understand pivot tables is to view it as a massive filter and math machine. It filters records, then performs math on the remaining visible records. Using the same list as before, I have built a simple pivot table report showing the total revenues for each product. I placed product into rows box and revenue into values box. Immediately, Excel created a summary pivot table showing total revenue for each product. But this is where the important understanding begins. What is actually happening here? Take the first product in the pivot table, a 354. The pivot table is effectively doing this. Step 1, the filter process. Excel goes to the full list. It processes each row in that list and keeps only rows where product equals A354. Everything else is ignored. Then it does step 2, the math process. Excel then adds all the visible revenue values from those filtered rows. It then returns this value to the pivot table report. So the critical understanding is this: the pivot table does not perform one giant calculation. Instead, every single number in the pivot table is separate calculation. Each figure is independent. So the figures for a 354 revenue, B713 revenue, and D157 revenue, etc., all come from separate filter plus math operations. This is one of the most important pivot table concepts users must understand. The pivot table is repeatedly filtering records, performing math on these filtered records, and finally returning the result of that math operation. Again, and again, and again, potentially hundreds or thousands of times. Let's watch a few more examples of this in order to emphasize the concept. Remember, all these calculations are taking place simultaneously. Here we have a visual representation of that process. Excel is going to a copy of the list, filtering for each value, performing the math, and then returning that value to the pivot table for all the items simultaneously. We will look at one last example. For this pivot table, we put customer and product in the row section, region in the column section, and revenue in the values section. As we scroll down, we can see that this pivot table contains about 300 separate independent calculations. Let's have a look at one of them. Where did this number, 55,440, come from? If we double-click on it, the pivot table will explain how it was calculated. But we already know Excel went to the full list. It filtered the list now for 3 conditions. The region must be central, the product must be D776, and the customer must be Cool Necktie Supply. After this filtering process, there are only 4 records remaining. Excel then adds up the visible revenues of them and returns the number 55,440 to the pivot table. Why pivot tables are so powerful? Without pivot tables, a user might need hundreds of sum-ifs, multiple filters, helper columns, manual calculations, and every formula would need to be built, checked, copied, and maintained. A pivot table can produce the same analysis in seconds. That is why pivot tables are one of the biggest time-saving tools in Excel. They automate massive amounts of repetitive filtering and calculation work instantly.